Hello. Today I'm talking about a brilliant book called Seven Principles of Making Marriage Work, which was written by Nan Silver and John Gottman. And this is a summary or my summary of the book. The disclaimer would be that this is, in some cases, I've used my own language and my own words if they made more sense to me, but the principles and the concepts are very much as they had presented them. The first thing, I wish they would have given the book a different name. I think it should be called The Seven Principles of Fulfilling Relationships. I don't think it should only be limited to marriage because the concepts in this book are so valuable to actually all relationships, not just our intimate partners and our marriages. So I would call it The Seven Principles for Fulfilling Relationships as the first part. I think it's really important to start with the context of why this book was written and why it's really important and interesting to listen to. So the two authors were scientists and really interested in the question around why do some relationships succeed and why do some fail? And they approached this question with a deep sense of curiosity and, yeah, kind of wonder. And what they created is a really phenomenal experiment, which they called the Relationship Lab, in which they had an apartment and they invited couples to stay in that apartment for a long weekend or just a weekend. And they would invite couples to stay and they would basically just watch them and collect a huge amount of data, from pee samples to heart rate monitoring, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that couples would come back every now and again and they collected this huge sum of data and then they analyzed the data, and the book is really a summary of their findings. And I think what's really amazing and really cool to think about is that they got to a point where they could observe a couple for about 15 minutes and they could determine in that short amount of time, based on the behaviors that they observed, with a very, very high accuracy, if a couple was going to divorce, or if they were going to break up, or if they were going to stay together. So kind of that, I think, is really phenomenal and really interesting. So that's kind of the starting point of why I think this work is super interesting and super exciting. So first off, let's start with an overview of what does this book entail, and I think about it in kind of three parts. The first part is about friendship and how do you nurture your friendship in a relationship. The second part is around how do you solve problems and resolve conflicts. And the last part is really about longevity. So how do you create shared meaning and shared values and longevity, and kind of write a story that lasts many, many years and not just a season. So if we go to the first part and talk about friendship. So friendship and nurturing the friendship has three components. And the first component, which they talk about, is this concept of updating your love maps. So what does that mean? When I read that, I was like, that's a weird concept. So it's kind of talking about that, when you get to know somebody, you get to know about their world and their internal world. What color do you like, and what's your favorite movie, and what book is really interesting you, and what's captivating your mind. And really what that means is that we have this image or idea of somebody in our head of what they like and what they don't like, what's important to them, what their values are, etc., etc. Like what's the things that have impacted them. So really what that means is that, that's kind of the map we have of them, and that's kind of the love map. And really the concept here is to say that love maps keep evolving. The person that's opposite of us isn't necessarily static. Like the ideas that they had yesterday might not be the same ideas in a year's time or in 2 years' time. And it's really around kind of going with that, like water that's flowing and adapting and changing. The person that's opposite from you is also evolving and changing, and being really curious about that and always kind of asking the question, what else can I learn about this person? Or how have they changed? How are they adapting? How are they different from what they were yesterday? So that's kind of part one around updating your love maps. And I think, yeah, it's the idea of continuously staying really curious about people. They wrote another book, which I really majorly recommend, called 8 Dates, which have kind of questions that really foster this sort of engagement where you keep learning about each other. So that's part one. Part two is kind of around, I think when we fall in love or if we first meet somebody, we see them through rose-tinted glasses, as I've demonstrated here. And as we get to know them, rose-tinted glasses, we only see the good. We don't necessarily see the good and the bad. But as time goes by, those glasses become more like normal glasses. And, everyone, we all have flaws. We have good sides, we have bad sides. We have things that are really wonderful and things that are deeply irritating. All of these things exist at the same time. And kind of the idea is that to nurture your friendship, you have to decide and choose to focus on the good versus the bad. So kind of because all of us have these two different sides and these parts of us that are wonderful and these parts that can be annoying to others, etc., etc. It's kind of this choice to put more focus onto the parts that you appreciate and that you admire about a person, and continuously doing that. So that's kind of the second part. So nurturing fondness and admiration. The third piece, one first has to explain this concept of, in engagements and what we do kind of on a very regular basis is that we make what they call this kind of bid for connection, which I've kind of represented here as a hook. So this could be anything like, oh, do you see that cloud out there? Or, oh, I just want a hug. Or anything where somebody reaches out to you, either through a physical action or through words, is like a hook. And it's really kind of asking for connection. And the way we respond to these hooks really, really is important. So we can respond to a hook to, like a bid for connection by connecting with the person. If somebody says, can I have a hug? We give them the hug. Or we can ignore them outright to say, I have better things to do right now. Or, maybe it doesn't suit our, maybe we're stressed and we have a meltdown and we scream at them because, right now a hug is not feasible or viable. And really the concept is around, in these moments where somebody is turning towards you and wants a bid for connection, is that you choose to turn towards them, and that you kind of choose the action which says, I'm showing up for you and I reciprocate and I connect with you too. So if we just summarize friendship into the three pieces, we nurture friendships by firstly enhancing our love maps. So being curious about our partners and the person opposite us and their internal world. By nurturing fondness and admiration. So really keeping in touch with the things we like and appreciate about the other person. And thirdly, by turning towards our partners when bids for connection are made. So those are kind of the three things to foster and nurture really positive friendships. The second piece is around, how do we manage conflict? So firstly, I think it's useful to separate conflict into two different types of conflict, which they did in the book as well. So the first conflict is kind of, I would nearly call it a logistical conflict, or it's like an everyday thing where, we've got different needs and we just have to kind of figure it out. And the second conflict, if you've been in a long-term relationship, is one of those, it's the recurring conflict. It's something that keeps coming up, and it's something that, maybe every 3 months it keeps coming up as an issue, and it's like a fight you've had 3 times or 5 times or 100 times already. And it's a really relatively, it's a very repeated nuance, and there's something kind of very recurring about it. So the way you solve these two problems are slightly different. So the first one, kind of a logistical problem, is the first part that's really critical, is this idea of like raising unmet needs. So in relationships, we basically negotiate, what is acceptable for us and what can you live with and what can I live with. But the thing is that maybe there's something that's in the relationship that you feel like is out of balance, or that I feel like I'm not comfortable with or I'm not okay with. And the thing is that, in this romantic notion that the other person can read our minds, we don't necessarily learn to speak up, to say, in the beginning everything's perfect, but later on things get annoying or irritating or something feels out of whack. So it's really around, you need to tell the other person if something's not working for you. You need to raise unmet needs, because only if they're raised can you then solve them. Because the challenge is, if you don't raise it, it builds up over time, and that can then lead to a massive explosion, which doesn't really serve anyone. So that's not very helpful. So that's part one. So kind of raising unmet needs. And the second piece, which is really critical, is kind of the ability and willingness to allow influence, which kind of translates to, in my own language, to allowing somebody to change your mind about something, or to be slightly, to be open-minded about, the fact that somebody else has a different lived experience or has a different perspective, and that you're willing to hear that and to absorb that and to make that part of your own picture in some way, shape, or form. There is actually a huge amount of additional detail on conflict management. I think that would be useful to do in a second video, but I'll leave it here for now, around kind of these everyday things where it's like, I need more rest, or I need you to spend more time with me, or I need to feel more connected, or, I'm feeling stressed about money. And those are kind of the everyday things that can come up from that perspective. When we have these things which are recurring issues, and I think different relationships will have different recurring issues, you pick your partner and you pick your recurring issue. And I think this can be exceptionally tough, because it can feel like you're never moving forward. It's like they have this beautiful analogy of two fists that are fighting against each other, and there's so much force going in both directions that you kind of stuck and you can't move. And the beautiful analogy that they use is kind of, behind or underneath the fist, if you open the hand, is some sort of dream, is something that both parties are fighting for. And kind of the way that one can start resolving these recurring issues is to be curious about what is the need, the underlying dream, the thing that each of you is fighting for so desperately, and really trying to be curious about that thing. So it's like, if the fight is about money, like, what does money mean, and is it actually about a need for security or a need for fun or adventure or travel? Like, what does this mean for two different people, as an example? So that's kind of fun and interesting to explore if you can get into a headspace where you can be curious about each other and do it in kind of like a fun and interesting way. So it's really around this idea of curiosity. So summarizing conflict. So I like the idea of reframing conflict as something we can learn from. So we learn about each other, we grow together. So that while life is wonderful, if there's no conflict, sometimes in relationships it can kind of be this really useful glue that once we learn about each other and we grow together from the conflict. So I've written it here as like, how do we learn through conflict, and what are the three things? So the first thing is to raise unmet needs. So problem solve collectively, rooted in kindness. And as I said, I think that's another video that'll come. The second piece is around allowing influence. So to be open to changing your mind. And the third piece is to detect dreams and conflict. So to be curious about what's going on in this entrenched perspective. Why is this so important to you? What is this specific thing that you're fighting for? What does it mean? What's going on there for you as a human being? The third kind of big pillar is around longevity. So how do we go from creating relationships that are short-term to really long-term, that last decades and still feel fulfilling and wonderful, 10 years down the line, and 20 years down the line, and 30 years down the line. So the 4 tips, and I'll be honest, so this part of the book I most probably understood the least when I read it. I might need to go back and read it again, but it makes more sense now to me, having been married for a bit and having been in a longer term relationship. It all makes more sense. So the first bit is around, for longevity, is around creating rituals. So rituals, and I think in all of this, what's really magical is that you need to create this for yourself in your own definition. So, maybe a ritual is that you come home and you give each other a hug for 5 seconds every time you get home, or maybe every night you cuddle for half an hour, or that you read a book together, or that you every year at the same time you do the same date on the day you met, or that you take the same holiday. Like, it doesn't really matter what the ritual is, but it's a ritual that means something to the two of you. And I think the power of it is that it creates a sense of security, and the sense of, I know that that you'll catch me, and that you'll be there, and that this thing that makes me feel good inside will happen. So there's something really powerful about creating rituals with somebody that you really care about. The second idea is this concept of, in life, we play many different roles. So in this picture, maybe somebody is really active in their career and they're a caregiver or a parent, they're an artist, and they're a really good friend. And these are all different roles and different ways we show up in the world. And the way that you can support your partner and your partnership is to support each other in the roles that you decide to take. So that means, like, if your significant other or whoever is in your life, it's really important for them to be a good son, or to be a great daughter, or to be a good mother. It's like, how can I show up for you that makes it easier for you to do that? And sometimes it's easy to get in the way of each other in this regard, but kind of being conscious of that, to be like, what roles are important to you? How do you want to show up in the world, and how can I support you in that? Is a really interesting thing to talk about with your partner and to explore together. The next thing is around creating shared goals. And yeah, this can, once again, it's what it means to you. So maybe the shared goal is, if you're in a long distance relationship, that you want to live in the same place again, or maybe it's that you want to be financially secure, whatever that means to the both of you, or maybe it means that you want to build a community around you, or that you want to climb a mountain together, or whatever it means. But kind of the idea of shared goals is that you set it together and you work towards it, and that can be really connecting. A friend of mine recently did a marathon with her husband, and I think that journey was deeply connecting because it was a shared goal that they shared. And the last bit is the one I understand the least, but I will try and explain it, is around kind of shared values and symbols. So if you get married, a ring is a symbol, and that's a shared symbol that maybe both of you choose to adopt. But other things can be symbols, like maybe home is really important, and that's an important symbol that you want to build together. Or, the values of how you want to raise your kids, or if you choose to have kids, can also be really important. So that's it's exploring like what are our shared values and our shared symbols, and how do we nurture those and grow them as time goes by. Right. So to summarize, longevity has three pieces. We create shared meaning through rituals of connection, by supporting each other's roles, by working towards shared goals, and by having shared values and symbols. There we go. That's a short summary of this beautiful book. I would love to hear your thoughts. The last thing I wanted to end with, which I think is so magical about this work, is that it doesn't actually matter who you are. It's actually down to behaviors. It's tiny behaviors that are in your control. So if you're aware of them, you can choose to behave differently. So I think I'll do another one on conflict management, because there's a lot of really amazing content on that, on kind of what are the specific behaviors that are really detrimental to relationships. But I'd be keen to hear what you think. And if you enjoyed this, thank you so much for watching. And I hope that you have a lovely day. Cheers.